How would you feel if your wife took you to dinner with her German boss, assuming you were blind to their secrets? What happens when the man everyone underestimates calmly exposes a web of lies, speaking perfect German at the perfect moment? This is the story of how I turned humiliation into a reckoning no one saw coming. The morning started like any other in the Turner household. I stood at the kitchen counter, methodically preparing Amber's favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes shaped like stars. The sizzle of batter hitting the hot pan filled the comfortable silence of our suburban home. At 38, I'd perfected the art of making mornings special for my 10-year-old daughter, even when her mother couldn't be bothered to look up from her phone. Natalie sat at the breakfast bar, her manicured fingers dancing across her smartphone screen, completely absorbed in whatever corporate drama awaited her at the German-American tech firm where she worked as a project manager. Her blonde hair was pulled back in that severe bun she favored for important meetings, and her navy business suit hung perfectly on her 35-year-old frame. She looked every inch the successful executive she'd worked so hard to become. "Morning, beautiful," I said, sliding a cup of coffee toward her. She barely acknowledged the gesture, her green eyes fixed on the glowing screen. "Daddy!" Amber's voice rang out as she bounded into the kitchen, her dark curls bouncing with each step. She wrapped her arms around my waist, and I felt that familiar warmth that made every sacrifice worthwhile. "Stars. You made star pancakes." "Only the best for my little astronomer," I replied, ruffling her hair. Amber had inherited her mother's intelligence, but thankfully retained the wonder and joy that Natalie seemed to have lost somewhere along her climb up the corporate ladder. Natalie's phone buzzed insistently. She glanced at it, and I caught a glimpse of a message in German before she quickly turned the screen away. Her lips curved into a smile I hadn't seen her direct at me in months. "I have to go," she announced, standing abruptly. "Big presentation today." She kissed Amber's forehead, but barely glanced in my direction. "Don't wait up tonight. Felix and I will probably be working late on the Kruger account." Felix? The name had been appearing more frequently in our conversations lately, always accompanied by that same secretive smile. Dr. Felix Kruger, her German boss, had apparently taken a special interest in Natalie's career development. After Natalie left, I helped Amber finish her breakfast and walked her to the school bus stop. She chattered excitedly about her upcoming science project, and I found myself treasuring these simple moments. Whatever was happening with my marriage, Amber remained the bright spot in my world. Later that afternoon, I decided to surprise Natalie at her office. The company was hosting a charity fundraiser, and she'd mentioned wanting me to network with her colleagues. I dressed carefully in my best suit and drove to the gleaming headquarters of Kruger Industries. The lobby buzzed with activity as employees and their families mingled around displays showcasing the company's latest technological innovations. I spotted Natalie across the room, surrounded by her usual circle of admirers. She looked radiant, confident, completely in her element. "Ethan!" She waved me over, but something in her expression shifted as I approached. "Everyone, this is my husband, Ethan. He's our stay-at-home dad." The way she said it, with just enough emphasis to make it clear she considered it a lesser role, stung more than I expected. Her colleagues smiled politely, but I caught the subtle exchanges of glances, the barely concealed smirks. "Wie süß," one of them murmured to another in German. "Sieht aus wie ein verlorener Welpe." How sweet. He looks like a lost puppy. They had no idea I'd spent 2 years in Berlin during my military service, becoming fluent in German long before I'd ever met Natalie. I'd never mentioned it because it had never seemed important. Now I simply smiled and nodded, playing the role they expected. "Natalie ist so geduldig mit ihm," another colleague whispered. "Ich könnte nie einen Mann heiraten, der weniger verdient als ich." Natalie is so patient with him. I could never marry a man who earns less than I do. Natalie laughed along with their comments, not bothering to defend me or even acknowledge the rudeness. She was too busy basking in their approval, too invested in maintaining her image as the successful woman who'd somehow ended up with the disappointing husband. I excused myself to get drinks, needing a moment to process what I'd just witnessed. At the bar, I overheard more conversations in German, casual cruelties spoken by people who assumed I was just another ignorant American. They discussed my marriage like it was office gossip, speculating about why Natalie stayed with someone so obviously beneath her station. When I returned with Natalie's wine, she was deep in conversation with a tall, distinguished man with salt and pepper hair and expensive clothes. Even before she introduced him, I knew this had to be Felix. "Ethan, meet Dr. Felix Kruger, our CEO," Natalie said, her voice taking on a breathless quality I rarely heard anymore. "Felix, this is my husband." Felix's handshake was firm, his smile perfectly calibrated for public consumption, but his eyes held a calculating coldness that made my skin crawl. When he spoke to me, it was with the patronizing tone reserved for children and the intellectually inferior. "Natalie tells me you take wonderful care of Amber," he said in accented English. "It must be rewarding, being so involved in her upbringing." There was something about the way he said Amber's name, too familiar, too possessive, and the way Natalie watched his face when he mentioned our daughter sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine. That evening, after putting Amber to bed, I found myself reflecting on the day's events in her darkened bedroom. She'd fallen asleep clutching the stuffed elephant I'd bought her for her birthday, her face peaceful and trusting. Whatever storms were brewing in my marriage, I was determined to protect her from the fallout. "Daddy?" she whispered, not quite asleep after all. "Yes, sweetheart? I'm glad you're my dad." The simple words hit me like a physical blow. "I'm glad too, Amber. I love you more than anything in this world." As I tucked her blanket around her shoulders, I heard Natalie's voice drifting from downstairs. She was on the phone, speaking in rapid German, her tone intimate and conspirative. I caught fragments as I moved closer to the stairs. "Nein, versteht nichts. Ist so naiv. Ja, morgen Abend ist perfekt." "No, he understands nothing. He's so naive. Yes, tomorrow night is perfect." I retreated to my home office, a small room that had become my sanctuary over the past few months. Surrounded by my books and the few personal items Natalie hadn't deemed worthy of the main living areas, I tried to make sense of what I'd witnessed. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "Working late again tomorrow. Don't wait up." I stared at the message, remembering the way she'd looked at Felix, the casual cruelty of her colleagues, the whispered conversation I wasn't supposed to understand. Something was happening, something that went far beyond simple marital neglect. I opened my laptop and began researching Dr. Felix Kruger. What I found painted a picture of a successful businessman with operations spanning both Germany and the United States. But it was a photo from a corporate event 5 years ago that made me pause. Felix stood next to a woman who looked remarkably like a younger version of Natalie, his arm around her waist in a gesture that spoke of intimacy rather than professional courtesy. The timestamp on the photo matched the period when Natalie claimed she had been in mourning after her first husband was gone in Germany. The same time frame when she'd supposedly been struggling as a young widow with a baby. I screenshot the photo and saved it to a new folder on my desktop. Whatever game was being played, I was no longer content to be an unwitting participant. The next morning brought more of the same routine, but now I watched everything with new eyes. Natalie's phone calls, her secretive smiles, the way she dismissed my attempts at conversation, it all took on new significance. As she prepared to leave for work, I noticed her phone light up with a calendar reminder. "Dinner with Felix, 8 p.m., Ristorante Germania." She glanced at the notification and quickly cleared it, but not before I'd memorized every detail. When she looked up, I was innocently reading the newspaper, playing the role of the oblivious husband she clearly believed me to be. "Have a good day, honey," I said, not looking up from the sports section. "Mm-hmm," she replied, already mentally elsewhere. After she left, I sat in my office staring at that calendar notification. Dinner with Felix at an upscale German restaurant, without me. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Tara McConnell's number. Tara had been a friend since college, now a successful attorney specializing in family law. We'd stayed in touch over the years, though our conversations had been limited to holiday cards and occasional social media interactions. It was time to change that. The call to Tara McConnell felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Her voice, professional yet warm, carried the same confidence I remembered from our college days when she'd argued circles around our political science professors. "Ethan Turner," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "It's been, 3 years since we actually talked? How are Natalie and Amber?" "That's actually why I'm calling." I found myself pacing around my home office, nervous energy making it impossible to sit still. "I need some legal advice. Hypothetically." The pause that followed told me Tara understood exactly what kind of conversation this was becoming. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to pure professional focus. "Why don't we meet for coffee? Tomorrow morning, if you're free. There's a place called Meridian Cafe on 5th Street. Quiet, private." After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day in a strange state of hyper-awareness. Every interaction with Natalie, every casual comment, took on new weight. But it was that evening, when she returned from her business dinner with Felix, that the pieces really began falling into place. She came home later than usual, her lipstick refreshed, her hair slightly mussed despite her attempts to smooth it. There was a glow about her that I hadn't seen in our own home for months. "How was dinner?" I asked from the couch, where I'd been reading while waiting for her return. "Oh, boring corporate stuff." She waved dismissively, but her eyes were bright with an excitement that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. Felix had some interesting ideas about expanding our German partnerships. Felix again. Always Felix. That night, as Natalie slept beside me, I found myself staring at the ceiling and remembering how we'd met. She'd been working as a consultant for an international firm, recently relocated from Germany. She told me her story over candlelit dinners and long walks through the city, a tragic tale of young love cut short by a car accident that claimed both her husband and their infant child. I'd fallen hard for her vulnerability, her strength in the face of such loss. When she'd revealed she was pregnant with what she claimed was our child, conceived during our whirlwind romance, I'd proposed immediately. The timeline had seemed tight, but love makes you overlook inconsistencies. Now, lying in the darkness, I forced myself to examine those inconsistencies with clearer eyes. The next morning, Meridian Cafe proved to be exactly what Tara had promised, a quiet corner spot with excellent coffee and enough ambient noise to ensure privacy. She'd chosen a table in the back, away from windows and other patrons. At 41, Tara had evolved from the passionate student activist I'd known into a polished professional, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat chignon, her dark suit speaking of success and competence. "So," she said after we'd exchanged pleasantries and ordered our drinks, "tell me what's happening." I found myself explaining everything: the casual disrespect, the German conversations, the secretive phone calls, the growing sense that my marriage was built on lies I was only beginning to understand. Tara listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "The timeline bothers me most," I admitted. When we met, Natalie said her husband had been gone for 6 months, but Amber was born exactly 9 months after our first date. The math works if she became pregnant immediately, but it also works if she was already pregnant when you met," Tara finished quietly. "Ethan, I have to ask, have you ever seen any documentation about this previous marriage? Certificates, licenses, anything official?" I shook my head. She said the paperwork was all in Germany, too painful to deal with. I never pushed because I didn't want to hurt her. Tara's expression grew grave. "We need to verify her story. If she lied about her marital status when you married, that could constitute fraud. And if Amber isn't your biological daughter, she's my daughter," I said firmly. "Biology doesn't change that, but I need to know the truth about everything else." "Fair enough. I can run some background checks, look into public records. But Ethan, if this goes where I think it might, you need to be prepared for the possibility that your entire marriage has been built on deception." After leaving Tara, I drove aimlessly through the city, trying to process the conversation. Eventually, I found myself at Riverside Park, where I often brought Amber to feed the ducks. The familiar setting helped calm my racing thoughts. My phone rang. Natalie. "Hey," she said, her voice carrying that distant quality that had become so familiar. "I'm going to be late again tonight. Felix wants to go over the Morrison proposal." "Of course he does." The words slipped out before I could stop them. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Just seems like you and Felix have been working a lot of late nights lately." The silence stretched uncomfortably before she responded. "He's my boss, Ethan. This is how careers are built. Not that you'd understand." The casual cruelty of the comment hit harder than a slap. "Right. Well, don't let me keep you from building your career." "I won't," she said, and hung up. I sat on the park bench, staring at my phone and wondering when my wife had become a stranger. Around me, other families enjoyed the afternoon sunshine, parents pushing children on swings, couples walking hand in hand, the simple domestic happiness that seemed to be slipping away from my own life. That evening, after putting Amber to bed, I found myself in the local wine bar where Natalie sometimes met her colleagues. I wasn't stalking her, I told myself. I just needed to get out of the house, away from the oppressive atmosphere of secrets and lies. I'd chosen a corner table with a view of the entrance, nursing a glass of red wine and reading a book I wasn't really absorbing. When Natalie walked in with her friend Lauren Bennett, I instinctively hunched lower in my seat. Lauren was everything Natalie aspired to be, effortlessly sophisticated, married to a successful investment banker, the kind of woman who collected social status like other people collected stamps. She and Natalie had bonded over their shared ambition and their mutual disdain for anything they perceived as ordinary. They settled at a table across the room, close enough for me to hear their conversation if I strained my ears. They ordered expensive wine and immediately launched into the kind of gossip that seemed to sustain their friendship. "So when does Felix's extended stay begin?" Lauren asked, her voice carrying clearly in the intimate space. "Next month," Natalie replied, and even from a distance, I could see her face light up. "The company is opening a permanent American office, and he'll be overseeing the transition." How convenient, Lauren said with a knowing smile. And how does Ethan feel about your boss being in town indefinitely? Natalie laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Ethan doesn't feel anything about it because Ethan doesn't know anything about it. He's too busy playing house husband to pay attention to my actual life. You're terrible, Lauren said, but she was laughing too. The poor man has no idea what's coming, does he? None whatsoever, and honestly, it's better that way. This transition needs to happen smoothly without complications. What about Amber? She's going to notice changes. Natalie's expression grew thoughtful. Amber will adjust. Children are resilient, and she deserves to know her real father. The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped my wine glass so tightly I was surprised it didn't shatter. I still can't believe you pulled off the whole tragic widow story, Lauren continued. Ethan never suspected? Why would he? I gave him exactly what he wanted. A damsel in distress to rescue, a ready-made family to complete his suburban fantasy. He never asked the hard questions because he didn't want to know the answers. They continued talking, but I'd heard enough. I left money on the table and slipped out through the back exit, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd overheard. Back home, I sat in my office with a legal pad, trying to organize the fragments of information into a coherent picture. Natalie had lied about being a widow. Felix was Amber's biological father. They were planning some kind of reunion that would fundamentally change my family's structure, and I was supposed to be too stupid to figure it out. I opened my laptop and began researching in earnest. Public records, social media, corporate filings, anything that might shed light on Natalie's true history. What I found confirmed my worst fears and opened up new questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. A German marriage license from 7 years ago, Natalie Hoffman to Felix Kruger. No divorce decree in the American databases I could access. Corporate records showing Natalie's employment with Felix's company dating back to before she'd claimed to be a grieving widow. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd built my life around, was still legally married to another man. Our entire marriage was a fraud, but the most damning evidence came from Felix's own social media presence. Photos from corporate events, family gatherings, vacation trips, a carefully curated life that included regular appearances by a woman who looked exactly like Natalie and a little girl who was unmistakably Amber. The photos were dated, some from before I'd even met Natalie, others from throughout our marriage, including several from times when Natalie had claimed to be attending conferences or visiting her sick aunt. I'd been living a lie for 10 years. My marriage was fake, my wife was a bigamist, and my daughter had a father who'd been actively involved in her life while I remained obliviously grateful for the privilege of raising another man's child. The rage that swept through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, but beneath the anger was something colder, more calculated. Natalie and Felix had played me for a fool, counting on my ignorance and good nature to maintain their deception. They were about to learn that underestimating someone could be a very costly mistake. I picked up my phone and called Tara. "I need to see you again," I said when she answered. "And I need to know everything there is to know about bigamy laws in this state." The upscale German restaurant Natalie had chosen for what she called a work dinner was exactly the kind of place she loved. Expensive, sophisticated, and designed to impress. Ristorante Germania occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian mansion, its interior a careful balance of old-world elegance and modern luxury. I'd agreed to attend when Natalie had casually mentioned it 3 days earlier, framing it as an opportunity for me to finally meet the colleagues she worked with most closely. "Felix especially wants to meet you," she'd said with that secretive smile I'd grown to recognize. "He's heard so much about you and Amber." Now, sitting at our reserved table, I understood this dinner was something else entirely. A performance designed to humiliate me while celebrating secrets I wasn't supposed to understand. Natalie had dressed for the occasion in a black cocktail dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her blonde hair styled in loose waves that caught the candlelight. She looked stunning, radiant, in a way that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with 10 years ago. But tonight, that radiance wasn't directed at me. Felix arrived precisely on time, commanding attention the moment he entered the restaurant. At 44, he possessed the kind of effortless authority that came from a lifetime of privilege and success. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair impeccably styled, his presence filling the space in a way that made other diners turn to look. "Ethan," he said, extending his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Finally, we meet properly. Natalie has told me so much about you." His handshake was firm, his English accented but precise. When he turned to greet Natalie, the change in his demeanor was unmistakable, warmer, more intimate, the kind of familiarity that spoke of shared history and private moments. "You look beautiful tonight," he murmured to her, his hand lingering on her arm just a moment too long for a professional relationship. I smiled and played my role, the devoted husband grateful to be included in his wife's important business dinner. I asked polite questions about the company, complimented the restaurant choice, and generally behaved exactly as they expected, slightly out of my depth but eager to please. The wine Felix ordered was expensive, a German vintage he described with the passion of a true connoisseur. As he poured, he began speaking more freely, occasionally lapsing into German when discussing technical aspects of the business. Unsere Expansion in den USA läuft besser als erwartet, he said to Natalie, his tone casual and confident. The American expansion is going better than expected. Ja, besonders mit den neuen Partnerschaften, she replied, her accent flawless in a way that surprised me. I'd never heard her speak German with such fluency. Yes, especially with the new partnerships. They continued their conversation, occasionally translating bits for my benefit, but clearly more comfortable speaking in their native language. I nodded along, asking the occasional question in English, maintaining my facade of polite incomprehension. It was when the main course arrived that the conversation took a more personal turn. Amber is doing well in school? Felix asked, his interest seeming genuine and paternal. Very well, Natalie replied. She's always been bright, takes after her father. The way she said it, with a meaningful glance at Felix, made my stomach clench, but I kept my expression neutral, cutting into my schnitzel as if I hadn't noticed the exchange. Sie wird schon bald erfahren müssen, was wirklich geschehen ist, Felix said quietly, his eyes on Natalie. She'll need to learn the truth soon. Ich weiß, aber noch nicht. Der Moment muss passen. I know, but not yet. The moment has to be right. Und was ist mit ihm? Felix glanced in my direction. And what about him? Natalie followed his gaze, her expression turning cold as she looked at me. When she spoke, her voice carried a casual cruelty that sent a sharp chill through me. Mach dir keine Sorgen. Dieser Mann ist glücklich, dein Kind großzuziehen. Don't worry. This man is happy raising your child. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to maintain my composure. I reached for the wine bottle, my hand steady despite the rage building inside me, and calmly refilled their glasses. Felix laughed, the sound rich with amusement and contempt. Hat wirklich keine Ahnung, oder? He really has no idea, does he? Keine. Ist zu gutmütig für sein eigenes Wohl. None. He's too good-natured for his own good. They continued their conversation, growing bolder in their assumptions about my ignorance. Felix described his plans to relocate permanently to the United States, to finally be a proper father to Amber. Natalie talked about the transition, how they would handle the revelation, how confident she was that I would accept the new arrangement without causing problems. Liebt Amber zu sehr, Schwierigkeiten zu machen, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. He loves Amber too much to cause trouble. Und ist zu schwach, sich zu wehren, Felix added with another laugh, and he's too weak to fight back. I took a sip of wine, using the moment to collect myself. The rage burning inside me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, but I channeled it into cold calculation. They thought they had me figured out, the weak, naive American who could be manipulated and discarded when convenient. They were about to learn how wrong they were. This is excellent wine, I said in English, my voice perfectly steady. German vintage, you said? Yes, Felix replied, pleased to demonstrate his expertise. From my family's region, we've been making wine there for generations. How wonderful to have such deep roots, I said, meeting his eyes directly. Family traditions are so important, don't you think? Something in my tone must have registered because Felix's smile faltered slightly. But Natalie, emboldened by wine and her own arrogance, pressed forward. Felix has been telling me about his estate in Bavaria, she said. It sounds like paradise. Perhaps someday we could visit. Perhaps, I agreed mildly, though I imagine it would be quite different from what Amber's used to here. Children adapt, Felix said dismissively, especially when they are where they belong. The possessiveness in his voice when he spoke about my daughter made my jaw clench, but I simply nodded and continued eating. Around us, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation, other diners enjoying their meals while oblivious to the drama playing out at our table. As the evening progressed, Felix and Natalie grew more comfortable, their German conversations becoming more frequent and more revealing. They discussed logistics, when Felix would make his move permanent, how they would break the news to Amber, what story they would tell their colleagues and friends. Das Wichtigste ist, dass Amber versteht, dass sich nichts Wesentliches ändern wird, Natalie said. The important thing is that Amber understands nothing essential will change. Außer dass sie endlich ihren echten Vater haben wird, Felix replied, except that she'll finally have her real father. The casual dismissal of my role in Amber's life, the assumption that I would simply step aside and accept their new arrangement, revealed just how little they understood about the man they'd been deceiving. When the check arrived, Felix insisted on paying, making a show of his generosity while explaining to me how important it was to invest in relationships. "Business is built on trust," he said, his eyes twinkling with private amusement, "on understanding between partners." "Absolutely," I agreed, shaking his hand warmly. "Trust is everything." As we prepared to leave, I excused myself to use the restroom. Instead, I stepped outside and called Tara from the restaurant's parking area. "I need to accelerate our timeline," I said when she answered. "How quickly can you have everything ready?" "Give me 48 hours," she replied without hesitation. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked back through the restaurant's windows, watching Natalie and Felix deep in intimate conversation, their heads close together, their body language speaking of secrets and shared plans that didn't include me. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The drive home was quiet, Natalie seemingly lost in thoughts that brought a satisfied smile to her face. She hummed softly, her fingers drumming against the passenger window, radiating contentment in a way I hadn't seen in years. "That went well," she said as we pulled into our driveway. "Felix really likes you." "He seems like an interesting man," I replied neutrally. "Very invested in his work." "Oh, he is. He's the kind of person who doesn't give up when he wants something. Very determined." "I can see that. And what he wants, he usually gets?" "Always," she said with certainty. "Felix doesn't accept defeat." I helped her out of the car, playing the role of the attentive husband one more time. But as we walked to our front door, I was already planning my next moves. Felix and Natalie thought they held all the cards, that their careful deception had left me with no options but acceptance. Tomorrow, they would begin to understand just how badly they'd miscalculated. Inside, I checked on Amber, who was sleeping peacefully in her bed, her face innocent and trusting in the dim light from the hallway. Whatever happened next, I was determined to protect her from the worst of the fallout. "Sweet dreams, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "Daddy's going to make sure everything works out just fine." In my home office, I opened my laptop and began typing an email to Tara, detailing everything I'd witnessed and overheard at dinner. Every German phrase, every meaningful glance, every assumption they'd made about my ignorance and weakness. They wanted to play games with my family, my life, my daughter's future. They thought they could manipulate me because they believed I was too stupid and too weak to fight back. It was time to show them exactly how wrong they were. Tara McConnell's law office occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming downtown tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city below. The space reflected her success: rich mahogany furniture, expensive art, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about its cost. I sat across from her desk, watching as she methodically reviewed the documents I'd provided. Bank statements, marriage certificates, corporate records, social media screenshots. 10 years of my life reduced to evidence of systematic deception. "This is worse than I initially thought," Tara said, setting down the last page. Her expression was grim, professional anger replacing her usual warmth. "Ethan, your wife isn't just having an affair. She's committed multiple felonies." "Explain it to me like I'm not a lawyer," I said, though part of me already understood the implications. "Bigamy, for starters. She was legally married to Felix when she married you, which makes your marriage invalid under state law, but more seriously, she's been systematically defrauding you financially." Tara pulled up a spreadsheet on her computer. "These transfers to German accounts, the credit cards you didn't know about, the loans taken against your house, we're looking at over $200,000 in misappropriated marital assets." The number hit me like a physical blow. 200,000? Probably more once we dig deeper. She's been planning this for years, Ethan. Slowly moving money, establishing credit, building a financial foundation for her real life with Felix. Tara's voice carried the controlled fury of someone who'd seen too many good people destroyed by the greed and selfishness of others. "What are my options?" "Legally, you have her completely cornered. Fraud, bigamy, identity manipulation. The district attorney would be very interested in a case like this. Civilly, we can recover the money, probably with damages and interest. But Ethan, you need to understand that going this route means total war. Once we file charges, there's no going back." I thought about Amber, sleeping peacefully in her bed while her world was about to be turned upside down. "What about custody?" "That's where it gets complicated. Biologically, you have no legal claim to Amber, but you've been her father in every way that matters for 10 years. A good family court judge will consider that, especially given the circumstances of the deception. We can fight for visitation, maybe even shared custody if we play it right." "And if we don't fight?" Then Felix and Natalie get everything. Your daughter, your money, your house, everything you've built, while they laugh about how easily they fooled the stupid American. The choice, when framed that way, wasn't really a choice at all. What do you need from me? Tara smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had an ally who understood the stakes. I need you to keep playing the fool for a little while longer. Don't change your routine. Don't let on that you suspect anything. Can you do that? I've been doing it for 10 years. I can manage a few more days. Good, because we're going to build a case so airtight they won't have any choice but to accept our terms. By the time we're finished, they'll be begging for mercy. Over the next week, I maintained my routine with Oscar-worthy performance skills. I made breakfast for Amber, drove her to school, attended her soccer game where I cheered louder than any other parent. I smiled when Natalie made her excuses about working late, nodded sympathetically when she complained about the stress of Felix's upcoming transition. But beneath the surface, I was gathering evidence with the methodical precision of a military operation. I installed monitoring software on our shared computer, capturing every email, every document, every financial transaction. I photographed important papers when Natalie was at work, copied files from her home office, and documented every suspicious phone call and unexplained absence. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd imagined. Natalie and Felix had been planning this reunion for years, carefully orchestrating Felix's transfer to the American office while systematically draining our joint accounts to fund their new life together. But the most damning evidence came from their email correspondence, conducted through what they thought was a secure German email service. Love letters, financial planning, detailed discussions about how to handle the Ethan problem once Felix was permanently relocated. Wird sich fügen müssen, Felix had written. Hat keine andere Wahl. He'll have to comply. He has no other choice. Ethan ist zu schwach, Probleme zu machen, Natalie had replied. Und liebt Amber zu sehr, sie zu verletzen. Ethan is too weak to cause problems, and he loves Amber too much to hurt her. They'd discussed custody arrangements as if I were already out of the picture, debated whether to let me have supervised visits or cut me off entirely. Felix favored the complete cutoff, arguing that Amber needed to bond with her real father without confusion. Natalie was more pragmatic, suggesting that some limited contact might prevent me from causing legal trouble. Reading their casual discussion of my daughter's future, of my complete removal from her life, filled me with a cold rage that sustained me through the most difficult moments of my performance. The breakthrough came when I discovered Felix's travel itinerary for his permanent relocation. He would be arriving in 3 weeks for what the company was billing as a major announcement, the opening of their new American headquarters with Felix as the permanent CEO. But the internal emails told a different story. This wasn't just a business expansion, it was a carefully orchestrated reunion designed to publicly establish Felix as a permanent fixture in our community, our social circle, and most importantly, Amber's life. The company was planning a welcome reception, a formal dinner to introduce Felix to local business leaders and celebrate the new partnership. Natalie was listed as the event coordinator, and I was included on the guest list as her supportive husband. It was perfect. A public venue, witnesses, all the key players gathered in one place for what they intended to be Felix's triumph. Instead, it would be the setting for their complete destruction. I called Tara with the details, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice as she absorbed the implications. A public company event, she mused. HR present, board members, local dignitaries. Ethan, they've handed us the perfect stage. What's the play? We let them have their moment. Let Felix give his speech. Let Natalie bask in her success. And then, when they're at their most confident, when they think they've won, we destroy them. Completely. By the time that evening is over, Felix will be facing criminal charges, Natalie will be unemployed and facing prosecution, and you'll have legal custody of Amber with a court order freezing all marital assets. Can you make that happen? Ethan, by the time I'm finished with them, they'll be lucky if they're not sharing a cell. That evening, Natalie came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed with excitement and wine. She'd been celebrating with her team, she explained, toasting the success of the upcoming reception. Felix is so excited about the announcement, she said, her eyes bright with anticipation. This is going to change everything for us. I'm sure it will, I agreed, helping her out of her coat. Change everything. She looked at me sharply, as if something in my tone had registered, but I was already turning away, playing the role of the devoted husband preparing for another evening of domestic routine. I should check on Amber, I said, make sure she's finished her homework. I found my daughter in her room, working on a science project about the solar system. She looked up when I entered, her face lighting up with the unconditional love that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Daddy, can you help me with Jupiter? I can't get the colors right. I sat beside her on the floor, helping her paint the gas giant's swirling storms while she chattered about her teacher's explanation of planetary formation. This was what mattered. These quiet moments, this trust, this bond that no biological connection could diminish. "Amber," I said carefully, "you know that no matter what happens, I'll always be your dad, right?" She looked at me with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. "Of course, Daddy. Why would that change?" "It won't," I promised, pulling her close. "It absolutely won't." Later that night, after Natalie had fallen asleep, I sat in my office putting the finishing touches on our case. Every document organized, every piece of evidence cataloged, every legal filing prepared and ready for execution. In 3 weeks, Felix and Natalie would walk into that reception expecting to celebrate their victory. Instead, they would face the consequences of 10 years of lies, manipulation, and the fundamental mistake of underestimating the man they'd chosen to betray. I opened my laptop and began typing one final email to Tara, confirming our timeline and strategy. As I wrote, I felt a sense of calm settle over me for the first time in months. The waiting was almost over. Soon it would be time for the reckoning they'd earned through their own arrogance and cruelty. They thought they knew me, weak, naive, easily manipulated. They were about to discover that the quiet man they'd dismissed was actually their worst nightmare, someone with nothing left to lose and the patience to plan their complete destruction. The game was almost over, and I was going to win. The Riverside Convention Center had been transformed into an elegant showcase for Kruger Industries' American debut. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in crisp white linens, while displays highlighting the company's technological innovations created an atmosphere of corporate sophistication. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's business elite: mayors, council members, CEOs, and the kind of influential figures who could make or break a company's reputation with a single conversation. I stood near the bar, nursing a glass of wine and watching the controlled chaos of final preparations. Natalie moved through the crowd like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, her black evening gown perfectly tailored, her smile radiant with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to achieve everything she'd worked toward. She looked stunning tonight, I had to admit. This was Natalie at her absolute best, intelligent, charming, completely in command of her environment. It reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her 10 years ago, before I'd understood that her ambition came with a price that others would always be expected to pay. "Ethan," she approached with Felix in tow, both of them glowing with anticipation. "There you are. Felix was just saying how grateful he is that you could be here tonight." Felix extended his hand with that practiced smile I'd grown to recognize. Tonight he wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers, every inch the successful executive celebrating his triumph. "This is a wonderful turnout," I said, shaking his hand warmly. "You must be very pleased with the reception." "Indeed, though I must give credit where it's due. Natalie has been instrumental in making tonight possible. I couldn't have asked for a more dedicated partner." The way he said partner, with just enough emphasis to make the double meaning clear, might have devastated me weeks ago. Tonight, it simply confirmed that their arrogance remained intact. "She's certainly dedicated," I agreed. "Natalie never does anything halfway." "Exactly what I admire about her," Felix replied, his hand moving to rest briefly on her lower back in a gesture that was intimate despite the public setting. Around us, the reception was reaching its peak. Local dignitaries mingled with corporate executives, champagne flowed freely, and the atmosphere buzzed with the kind of energy that accompanied successful business launches. Several people had approached me throughout the evening, curious about my connection to the guest of honor, and I'd played my role perfectly. The supportive husband, proud of his wife's professional success. What none of them knew was that Tara McConnell was seated at a corner table, dressed elegantly enough to blend in with the crowd while maintaining constant communication with the team of investigators and legal assistants, positioned strategically throughout the venue. The district attorney's office had a representative present, ostensibly as a guest, but actually prepared to execute warrants the moment our signal was given. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, "please take your seats for this evening's presentation." The crowd settled at their assigned tables as Felix made his way to the podium. I found myself seated at the head table, positioned between Natalie and Patrick Doyle, the company's HR director. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd given me a front row seat to what they intended to be my humiliation. Felix began his speech with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. He spoke eloquently about international partnerships, technological innovation, and the bright future of German-American business cooperation. The audience was captivated, hanging on his every word as he painted a vision of prosperity and progress. Success in business, he said, his accented English carrying clearly through the sound system, requires more than just good ideas. It requires trust, dedication, and the courage to make difficult decisions for the greater good. I caught Natalie's eye and smiled, raising my wine glass slightly in acknowledgement of his words. She beamed back at me, clearly interpreting my gesture as admiration for her boss's eloquence. Tonight represents not just the opening of a new office, Felix continued, but the beginning of a new chapter. Sometimes, to build the future we envision, we must be willing to leave the past behind. The audience applauded enthusiastically, but I noticed several people glancing in my direction, perhaps picking up on subtle undercurrents they couldn't quite identify. Felix's speech was masterfully constructed, but to anyone paying close attention, it contained clear hints about major changes ahead. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the exceptional work of my project manager, Natalie Turner, Felix said, gesturing toward our table. Her dedication, her intelligence, and her willingness to sacrifice for the good of the company have been truly inspiring. More applause, warmer this time, as the spotlight found Natalie. She stood gracefully, acknowledging the recognition with the poise of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years. When she sat back down, her hand briefly touched mine, the first genuine physical contact we'd shared in months. "Thank you for being here tonight," she whispered. "I know this isn't really your scene, but it means a lot to me." For just a moment, looking at her flushed face and bright eyes, I felt a pang of something that might have been regret. Despite everything she'd done, despite the lies and betrayal, part of me still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with. But then I thought about Amber, about the casual way they'd discussed removing me from her life, and my resolve hardened. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied softly. "This is your big moment." Felix concluded his speech to thunderous applause, and the formal portion of the evening transitioned into networking and celebration. I watched as he worked the room, accepting congratulations and building the relationships that would support his new American venture. Natalie stayed close to his side, introducing him to key contacts and basking in the reflected glory of his success. I excused myself from the table, ostensibly to visit the restroom, but actually to check in with Tara. I found her near the back of the room, her expression calm but alert. "Everything's in position," she said quietly. "The moment you give the signal, we move." "How long do we have?" "Patrick Doyle leaves at 10:30 for another engagement. If we're going to do this with maximum impact, it needs to happen in the next 15 minutes. I nodded, feeling the familiar calm that had sustained me through the most difficult moments of my military service. Everything was ready. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal framework was solid, and all the key players were exactly where we needed them to be. "One more thing," Tara said, her voice softening slightly. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Once we start, there's no going back." I looked across the room at Natalie and Felix, watching as they shared a private moment of triumph, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully manipulated me into accepting my own destruction. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I said. I returned to the head table, where Felix was regaling the other guests with stories of his business philosophy. He looked up as I approached, his smile warm and confident. "Ethan, perfect timing. I was just explaining to Patrick how important it is to surround yourself with people who understand their roles, who don't create unnecessary complications." "Absolutely," I agreed, taking my seat. "Understanding your role is crucial, though sometimes people discover they've been playing the wrong part entirely." Something in my tone must have registered because Felix's smile faltered slightly. But before he could respond, I was reaching for the wine bottle, playing the attentive guest, ensuring everyone's glasses remained full. "Shall we toast to new beginnings?" I suggested, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet space around our table. "Of course," Felix replied, though his eyes had grown watchful. I stood, wine glass in hand, and the conversations at nearby tables gradually quieted as people realized something significant was about to happen. Natalie looked up at me with surprise and what might have been the first hint of concern. "To new beginnings," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the elegant reception hall. "And to the truth finally coming to light." The moment had arrived. 10 years of lies, manipulation, and casual cruelty were about to meet their reckoning, and I was going to savor every second of their destruction. The reception hall fell into an expectant hush as I remained standing, wine glass raised, all eyes focused on what appeared to be an impromptu toast from the guest of honor's supportive husband. Felix and Natalie looked up at me with expressions that had shifted from confident anticipation to the first stirrings of unease. "You know," I began conversationally, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet space, I've learned so much this evening about international partnerships and the importance of trust in business relationships. Polite murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Felix's smile remained fixed, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes as he tried to determine where this was heading. Felix, your speech about leaving the past behind was particularly inspiring, I continued, meeting his gaze directly. It got me thinking about my own past and some interesting discoveries I've made recently. Natalie's face had gone pale, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Around us, the other guests sensed the shift in atmosphere even if they couldn't yet understand its cause. For instance, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket and withdrawing a manila folder, I discovered that my wife has been having the most fascinating conversations in German, assuming I wouldn't understand them. The color drained from Felix's face as the implications hit him. Natalie made a small, choked sound that might have been my name. Just this evening, in fact, I continued, my voice remaining perfectly calm and conversational, Natalie assured you that I would never cause problems because I'm too ignorant and too weak to understand what's really happening. I turned to address Natalie directly, switching seamlessly to fluent German. Sie haben mir gesagt, mach dir keine Sorgen, dieser Mann ist glücklich, dein Kind großzuziehen. You told him, don't worry, this man is happy raising your child. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Natalie's champagne glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Felix went rigid, his face cycling through shock, fear, and desperate calculation. But I wasn't finished. Oh, so you're Amber's father? I continued in German, my voice carrying the same conversational tone as if we were discussing the weather. Wie wunderbar, dass du lebst, denn meine Frau hat mir erzählt, du seist bei einem Autounfall gestorben. How remarkable that you're alive, because my wife told me you were lost in a car accident. The silence that followed was absolute. Every conversation in the reception hall had stopped. Every face turned toward our table where the evening's celebration had transformed into something else entirely. Patrick Doyle, the HR director, was the first to recover his voice. What exactly is happening here? I opened the manila folder and began distributing documents with the methodical precision of someone who had planned this moment down to the last detail. What's happening, Patrick, is that your CEO and my wife have been conducting an elaborate fraud for the past 10 years. I handed him a set of papers. Marriage certificates showing that Natalie was legally married to Felix when she married me, making her a bigamist and our marriage invalid. More documents followed, each one landing on the table with the weight of irrefutable evidence. Bank records showing systematic theft of marital assets totaling over $200,000, transferred to German accounts controlled by Felix. Email correspondence detailing their plans to remove me from my daughter's life once Felix's relocation was complete. Felix finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. This is not what it appears. Really? I replied, still in German. Because your own emails suggest otherwise. Shall I read some of them aloud? Perhaps the one where you called me zu dumm zum Leben, too stupid to live? Natalie tried to stand, her face ashen, but her legs wouldn't support her. Ethan, please, let me explain. Explain what? I asked, my calm finally cracking to reveal the cold fury beneath. Explain how you lied about being a widow to manipulate me into marriage. Explain how you've been stealing from our joint accounts to fund your real life with your actual husband. Explain how you've spent 10 years laughing at the stupid American who was grateful for the privilege of raising another man's child. The room erupted in shocked whispers and the subtle sounds of phones being activated as guests began documenting what was clearly going to be the scandal of the year. At that moment, Tara McConnell appeared at my side, flanked by 2 investigators and a representative from the district attorney's office. Felix Kruger and Natalie Turner, Tara announced in her clear, authoritative voice. You're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bigamy, and theft of marital assets. The investigators moved with practiced efficiency, producing handcuffs while reading rights. Felix tried to protest, his voice rising in panicked German, but the legal machinery was already in motion. Patrick, I said, turning to the stunned HR director, you'll want to review these employment records. They show that Natalie has been falsifying expense reports and using company resources for personal business. I believe your board will find the liability exposure quite concerning. Patrick Doyle's face had gone gray as he absorbed the implications. His company's new American launch was collapsing in real time, in front of the city's most influential business leaders, with social media capturing every moment. The board will need to convene an emergency meeting, he said numbly. This is catastrophic. Yes, I agreed. It really is. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Natalie looked at me with an expression of pure desperation. What about Amber? She needs stability. She needs a father who loves her, I interrupted. Which she has. The custody papers are already filed, along with a restraining order preventing either of you from contacting her until this is resolved in court. Felix was shouting now, a stream of German profanity and threats that only served to make him look more unhinged as the investigators led him toward the exit. The reception guests parted before them like the Red Sea, phones recording every moment of their perp walk. "Ethan," Natalie whispered as they prepared to lead her away. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had been the center of my world for 10 years, who had given me the greatest gift of my life in Amber, even as she built that gift on a foundation of lies. "No," I said quietly. "It was supposed to happen exactly like this. You just never thought I was smart enough to figure it out." As they were led away, the reception hall buzzed with the kind of energy that accompanies witnessing history in the making. Business cards were being exchanged, reporters were being called, and the story was already spreading through social media with the viral intensity that would make this the defining scandal of the year. Patrick Doyle approached me, his face grave with the weight of corporate damage control. "Mr. Turner, I want you to know that the company had no knowledge of any of this. We'll be conducting a full investigation and cooperating completely with law enforcement." "I'm sure you will," I replied, "though you might want to review your hiring practices. This kind of fraud doesn't happen overnight." Tara appeared at my elbow, her expression satisfied in the way of someone who had just executed a perfect legal strategy. "The assets are frozen, the custody order is in effect, and both of them are looking at serious jail time," she reported. "How do you feel?" I looked around the reception hall, at the shocked faces and whispered conversations, at the wreckage of what was supposed to be Felix and Natalie's triumph. Then I thought about Amber, safe at home with the babysitter, finally free from the web of lies that had defined her entire life. "I feel like going home to my daughter," I said. As I walked toward the exit, leaving behind the chaos and scandal, my phone buzzed with a text from the babysitter. "Amber's asleep. Hope your evening went well." I smiled, typing back, "Better than expected. I'll be home soon." The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. Behind me, the reception hall continued to buzz with the aftermath of the evening's revelations, but that was no longer my concern. Felix and Natalie had played their game with skill and ruthless determination, counting on my ignorance and weakness to ensure their victory. They had underestimated the quiet man they'd chosen to betray, never imagining that patience and careful planning could be more devastating than any amount of arrogance and cruelty. Now they would spend the next several years discovering just how costly that miscalculation would prove to be. I got in my car and drove home to my daughter, leaving their destruction behind me in the rearview mirror where it belonged.